Okay, so well, now it's my honor and pleasure to present Corey. I'm very happy to have you, and I'm very much looking forward to listen to your presentation. So, well, I will briefly introduce Corey. Corey Lee Wrenn is from the University of Kent. Dr. Wrenn is lecturer of sociology with the School of Social Policy, Sociology and Social Research, and co-director at the Center for the Study of Social and Political Movements at the University of Kent. They served as council member with the American Sociological Association's Animal and Society section from 2013 to 2016, and was elected chair in 2018 and co-founded the International Association of Vegan Sociologists in 2020. Yay! Great. Dr. Wrenn has been published in several peer-reviewed academic journals, including the Journal of Gender Studies, Environmental Values, Feminist Media Studies, Disability and Society, Food, Culture and Society and Animals. She is the author of A Rational Approach to Animal Rights, Extensions in Abolitionist Theory, published by Pelgrave Macmillan in 2016. Also, Piecemeal Protest, Animal Rights in the Age of Nonprofits, published by the University of Michigan Press in the 2019. And Animals in the Irish Society, published by Sunny Press in 2021. But forthcoming in 2026, you are going to have published your latest book, that is Vegan Witchcraft, Contemporary Magical Practice and Multi-Species Social Change. And now you're going to present on vegan feminist visions. So thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laura. Muchas gracias. Thank you. Hola, thank you. I'm very, very excited to be here. I was here 6 years ago for the Critical Animal Studies Conference, and it's very strange to be back here again, because it's like you never think you'd have a second opportunity to come to somewhere so beautiful. So just, before I get started on this, I just want to give you a bit of background on what it is. It's a work in progress, just like Kadri's presentation. I'm very excited to just be able to give you a snapshot into the behind the scenes of what I hope will be a very important and useful and interesting book. It's a book that is over 10 years in the making, in that I started also, and thank you for all that stuff for my bio. I feel a bit geeky having you read that, but that's me. But another thing that I did was I formed a Vegan Feminist Network back in 2013, which was back in the days when blogs were cool. They're not so cool anymore. But like all kinds of folks who we would not have heard of otherwise before they wrote their own books. Folks like Aavik, Michelle Kaplan, now Michelle Summerstein, who's a disabled woman who's also Jewish and queer, and like all women who would never have gotten platform elsewhere. We were writing on Vegan Feminist Network and just making ourselves heard and seen and read. And I started at that time starting to explore vegan feminism as a concept and as a history, because we didn't really have a lot of information on that. And so it was a lot of just out of my own personal curiosity. So way back then, back in 2013, I created a history of vegan feminism as I understood it, or as what I could find on the website. It's still there. And I just said, gosh, it's just so much. It needs to become a book. But it also needed a lot of work and a lot of dedication and time to make it into a book format. I'm already at like 100,000 words, and it needs to be cut down significantly. Carol Adams she was interviewed for the book, and she had a lot of comments on that. She said, if you don't make it shorter, no one's going to read it, Corey. So I want to go back to the drawing board on that. And speaking of Carol Adams, I stole this straight. This is plagiarism from her, because in our interviews, she kept calling it your vegan feminist visions. I was like, that sounds really nice. I like that. So that's where I am with that. It's very much so in progress right now. I've just completed the interviews. Laura was one of them. And if you weren't interviewed, please don't be offended. I only had so much brain space for that and book space. And honestly, I was trying not to interview so many academics. I was trying to get more people who were on the ground. And the book, the monograph, the first draft, will go to the publisher this December. So hopefully it'll see the light of day by the end of next year. But yeah, in the meantime, and some of this may surface, I have a book that will actually be releasing in August, although its official release date is next year. It's Vegan Witchcraft. I know that sounds woo, But it's built on the same kind of idea, my interest in vegan feminism and not just critiquing, which is a lot of what vegan feminism does, but also what do we build after that? What do we create after that? Aavik said this to me many years ago because, well, I was an angry little vegan. I surely was in my 20s, and so was Aavik. And Aavik said to me, like, we spend so much time, like, breaking stuff down, but we never spend any time building stuff up. And that really, like, gives me chills thinking about it because here I am all these years later trying to do some of the building up. So the vegan witchcraft book that's coming out soon this summer is part of that project. And so is this book project, which is just called Vegan Feminism. I'm not completely plagiarizing Carol Adams, just for today's talk I am. So that's the background on this. So I'm going to take you on a journey. I'm going to tell you a little story. This is vegan feminism as I know it. And as I learned through all of my interviews, lots of people have different understandings of what vegan feminism is. So I think it's more accurate to call it vegan feminisms. And this is my label. I called it vegan feminism back in 2013. I liked it. I liked the way it sounded, and I'm sticking with it. But just to let you know that there are lots of different definitions and understandings. So I'm going to be showing you some of the developments across the centuries, yes, centuries, and I've carved this into 3 waves. Just like in the mainstream feminist movement, people get kind of cantankerous about dividing the movement into waves and what starts a wave, what ends a wave. You can say that as well with vegan feminism. This is just my 2 cents and how I categorize it, having been stuck in the research for so many years. I'm going to be showing you some of the key challenges, some of the past key challenges and those which continue today. We're going to look at some limitations, of which there are many and to be expected. And then, of course, in line with the theme of the conference and the theme of really, I hope, the next stage of my career is the building up bit, not just the breaking down. So how do we envision these vegan feminist futures? There's Marty Keel. So I'm going to incorporate some interesting pictures and bits and bobs I found through my research, by the way. And this is some early newspaper coverage of Marty Keel before she became the famous vegan feminist. I think before she was even vegan or vegetarian at this point. So anyway, how do we define vegan feminism, or how do I attempt to do so? I like Adams's approach where we're looking at this as the political is personal, because when we're talking about veganism, it's not just a critique of social relations. Of course, it also has to do with a very personal thing of what do we put into our body, what do we put onto our body, and who do we share our beds with, etc. There's a very personal thing, our vegan politics. So we can definitely pull that. Whoops. How do I get that back? There we go. Wrong button. We can definitely pull that from the mainstream feminist movement, the political being personal. It's also very, very, very intersectional. We got a bit of taste of this earlier this morning, but this is really the heartbeat of vegan feminism. It is deeply committed to intersectionality, however you wish to frame that. So we will come back to that as a point of conflict later. It's definitely rooted in ecofeminism. In fact, you might call it an outgrowth of ecofeminism. And certainly more recently, we've been drawing more heavily on Black feminism. And beyond that, right? You'll see more of that coming through with the interviews. And by the way, the interviews are not really in today's talk because I haven't transcribed them yet. They just actually finished a couple weeks ago. So this is simply based on sort of my reflections on that. So yeah, and I like this is from a recent book on veganism and feminism, feminist animal multi-species studies, which actually attempts to make some definitions and basically broadening it out. And I think this activist also made the pretty controversial statement that feminism really isn't about women so much anymore. And I think there's some truth to that, because we've kind of moved beyond that to understand that this is a structural critique of all types of differences and marginalities. Woof, okay, I'm going to talk you through this. You don't have to read it all. But then another question, again, this is plagiarizing Carol. Why veganism? Well, why vegan feminism now? And she wrote this article. Is it down here? No, it's not cited here, but this comes from an article I think she wrote in 2010. And I really was drawn to it because it's the first time I really saw vegan feminism published that I'm aware of, that I can remember. But why now? So why are we revisiting this? Why did it kind of take off, if my theory is correct, about 10, 15 years ago? Well, the history of this is that women have always been mocked for their concern and compassion for non-human animals and their attempts to be active on their behalf. They've always been mocked, and not always by the folks from the outside, but unfortunately from a lot of folks from the inside, animal rights activists themselves. So there's been an attempt really to sort of putting women back into that history. That was one of my goals when I started the Vegan Feminist Network back in 2013. So Linda Vance, writing in the book Ecofeminism, 30 years ago now, was also saying we're trying to write women back into this history. Other women who are in academia doing this work have acknowledged that actually it's just institutional sexism while we haven't been talking about this before. So the really good worth a read article on what Freeman calls pussy panic, which is a play on words, right? And I feel like as an American, I'm allowed to use that word now because my wonderful president loves to grab them. I can use that word too. I will also claim that. But anyway, the idea was institutional sexism and also speciesism. Well, we can't talk about women's issues and we can't talk about animal issues. Those aren't serious. But by gosh, when you start to have, if we have a laser pointer, yeah, well, sorry, it's not showing up. Derrida and Wolf and, well, all right, Haraway, which is a woman, but okay. But when you have Singer and Reagan and white men come and speak the truth about these hidden inequalities, whoa, okay, let's publish them and give them keynote speeches. But women have been doing this all along, right? And we see, this is, again, Greta Gard wrote on this, and she's always been on top of this this pussy panic. So even today, though, I would argue that vegan feminism, because of this institutional sort of, oh, vegan's pretty radical, so is feminism. We don't really talk about it when we know what it is. And this is not to throw shade. Like, I know that people have various reasons why they don't use the term vegan or they don't use the term feminist. Even Carol Adams, shame, she heard about, before I even interviewed her, she heard that I had a contract with Bloomsbury for this book, and it's called Vegan Feminism, like I'm not apologizing. She emailed me, and I think she was apologizing a bit. She's like, "Whoa, this is the first time my book will have vegan on the cover." You know, the very famous Sexual Politics of Meat. It was only until this year, the 35th anniversary edition, that she finally dropped the word vegetarian, which she knows she never meant in the beginning. She always meant vegan. Now she's put vegan on there. She's been asked why she's done that, and she said, well, it was some male graduate student who emailed her and asked her why. I think that's kind of a cop-out. She's also said things like, that her editor really discouraged her from using that word vegan, that vegan didn't mean, people didn't know what veganism meant at the time, which I don't know if I really buy because I've been vegan for almost 25 years and I knew what vegan meant at the time, and I was desperate and hungry for any kind of discussion, political discussion or social discussion, cultural discussion of veganism. It was there. It was simply that we had these institutional blocks. Well, anyway, Carol's on board now, so we got vegan feminists on the book cover finally in 2025. But yeah, other books have been coming out that also are quite new and still not quite using the word vegan feminism loud and proud, although I'm hoping that will now change because we have some oomph to support that and some cultural, I guess, resonance for veganism now. So here's what I did for the book, just very quickly. It is mostly, is it? No, it's not. It's a three-parter. I think the thing that's taking me the longest is the literature review. So I've actually been collecting for over 10 years anything and everything that ever had to do with feminism and animals and just putting it in my EndNote files. And now I've been systematically, for the past year, going through all those, reading them, making notes, and integrating them into an analysis, and it's taking ages. That's just the 300 that I had. Of course, through a purposive analysis, the reviewers were like, okay, well, what about other parts of the world, and what about queer studies, et cetera? So I've been actively trying to build out my repertoire a little bit more. Queer studies is like it's a new one. There's lots of good, amazing stuff coming out in queer studies and animals and veganism. But as far as outside of the West, I'm having a lot more difficulties. So if anybody has any good stuff they want to turn me on to, by all means, send it over. I mean, I'm finding random stuff, like apparently there's a vegan feminist network in South Korea, or was. Like someone's published a chapter on that. It's like, wow, which I never would have found if I hadn't been doing this research. The other thing I've done is a content analysis. I've looked at some of the historic publications from women in the Victorian era. There are more than I could possibly do, and I'm already, like I said, already at the word limit, but this is inspiration for anyone else who's interested in this history. They left a very, very robust written record, and it's really ripe for more people to go and look through that. But I did look at a few. Specifically, I looked at the Ladies' Own paper, which was briefly edited by Anna Kingsford, who we'll come back to in a moment, one of the first medical doctors in the UK. Also went through every single issue of Feminists for Animal Rights newsletter, published from like 1982 or 1983 until about 2000. So that, and that's all on their website as well if anyone's interested. So that was like for the more 20th century stuff. Then Marty Keel, bless her, she's no longer with us, but there's a massive, huge collection of stuff that she's amassed over her career that's at Smith College, and thankfully almost all of it has been digitized. And that is pretty much all I was doing for January, actually through Christmas time all the way up until springtime, just going through that. It was thousands and thousands and thousands of documents. So there's a very strong presence of Marty Keel in this book. Lots and lots of unpublished articles, correspondence, etc. It gives you a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff. And then the third part here is I've interviewed vegan feminists, and as I understood them to be, they didn't always identify as such. As I said, I tried to steer clear of just doing academics. That would have been easy. I know a bunch of academics. But what about people who are doing vegan feminism in the field, people who are artists, people who are cooks, people who are veterinarians, who are doctors, et cetera, and I have to credit Carol. She turned me on to a lot of these folks that I wouldn't have known about because she herself is not really, she doesn't identify as an academic, so she knows a lot of different folks who do this stuff. Okay, so this is where I'm at with this. I'm going to break this down into 3 different waves. And then I'm going to come back at the end and try to summarize what I think we can glean from this history. And again, history is so important. I always wanted to do history, and I was talked out of it and told to do a sociology degree instead, but haha, I still get to do history. Because I think it's very important because we need to learn from this. Had I known as a teenage girl that this whole legacy of strong, amazing, intelligent, creative women existed, it would have changed my career. It would have changed my life course. I would not have to struggle in a lot of ways that I did. So this is, I think, very empowering to know our history. And I think it's a real shame that the animal rights movement has really ghettoized women's contributions. Things are starting to change a little bit. I covered this in my second book, Piecemeal Protest, a lot of the feminist sort of disparagement. But like the Animal Rights Hall of Fame, when I did that research 10 years ago, it was like 60 to 70% of those considered Hall of Famers were men. And nobody knew about what women were doing. So it's a radical act then, I think, to sort of remember what women are doing and their amazing contributions. So the first wave I kind of loosely put around 1800 to 1945, and as you see here, I'm trying to get the bulk of the Industrial Revolution through the war years, through the creation of the vegan society, but then it becomes a sort of a, I don't want to say completely dormant, but slightly less active time after the 1940s for obvious reasons. So in the 1800s, we see a significant, well, we call it Industrial Revolution for a reason. The revolution, I think, becomes a turn of phrase, and we forget that revolution really means drastic, all-encompassing change to all types of social institutions, arrangements, and hierarchies. So certainly this was a time when our relationships with animals were changing, and then that also prompts folks to start thinking differently about our obligations to other animals and how we will relate with them. So this is also an interesting point because this is a deeply sexist time. Let's be honest, women were still considered property in a lot of ways, not given the vote. But this was one way that women could exercise their political voice by being active in these charities, creating charities, writing, publishing things, getting medical degrees. Some of the women, the first women who ever got medical degrees, like the 2 pictured here, that's Lizzie Lind F. Hegeby. Sorry, she's Swedish and I always mess it up. And Anna Kingsford. 2 of the women who first got medical degrees just so they could go into these laboratories that were cordoned off to women in the public, basically, and see what was going on to the animals in these vivisection laboratories and for medical and medical schools. So this was an amazing kind of impetus for women to stretch their political wings, if you will. Another interesting thing that we don't really talk about is, I think we're going to come back to this when I look at the second wave of vegan feminism, but one of the things we don't really talk about with the first wave is that it was very much so imbued with a spiritual sort of impetus. And a lot of them were actually straight up, let's call it, they were witches. They were mediums, they were psychics, they held seances, they cast spells. Like, this is some real gothic stuff. And I was really excited about this. Like, Anna Kingsford has written tons and tons on this that most people have never even explored before. And Lizzie, who came, I think she really came on the scene after Anna Kingsford had died. Anna Kingsford died at only about 41 years old. But when Lizzie came back from that, she felt like she had been receiving messages from Anna Kingsford that pushed her through her career. And it was only in her obituary that one of her colleagues let slip that, yeah, she thought she was on a mission from Anna Kingsford. We're actually embodying the spirit of the women who came before us. And you can imagine in the Victorian times, you really needed that sort of spiritual oomph to get you through when you were really facing quite a lot. And indeed, like Lizzie faced quite a lot of backlash. She was actually taken to court for libel after publishing the very famous 1906 book, Shambles of Science, with her partner, and she was gay, by the way, and with her partner, Lisa. So they went in and they published this book, and one interesting thing was we were just talking about that vivisection panel about how it starts to change and re-socialize medical students. They were very well aware of the spectacle involved. And they were really disgusted about what they saw was that this wasn't about science or medicine or whatever. This was about men getting together to enjoy themselves over violence of a vulnerable being. And the more violent, the more the animals screamed, the more the animals resisted, the more excited the students got, and the more excited the professor got. And so she created a chapter, and the chapter was titled Fun. And you can imagine where it goes from there. And eventually she had to have it redacted. But it fired her up like you wouldn't believe. And she said, I'm not going to stop there. I mean, the fortitude of this woman. So she got together with some other anti-vivisectionists. And maybe you have heard of the old brown dog statue that was in Battersea in central London. And the idea was, let's put it here next to an anti-vivisection hospital. Because back in the day, vivisection was actually practiced in a lot of hospitals, which made a lot of poor people nervous because, yeah, poor people were also going to be dissected or tested on, all this kind of stuff. So they put it there, and the medical students were not having it. There's a bunch of kind of back and forth, and eventually, back and forth is just a nice way of saying there was rioting. There's basically rioting. Finally, the police said, we can't afford to manage this anymore. It has to come down. She wouldn't be stopped there. They had a big protest in Trafalgar Square. Thousands of people showed up to listen to them speak. And then she didn't stop there. She went on to form the Anti-Vivisection and Animal Defense Society, which was active well into the 20th century and extremely prolific. And hint, hint, if anybody's looking for a research idea, I would love for people to go into her writings and the records of the work that she did for that society that she formed. So this is amazing stuff. And then Anna Kingsford had to go to France because she couldn't do it in England to get a medical degree, again, so she could learn about what's happening to animals, and also wrote one of the very first books on vegetarian nutrition. Cool stuff. So yeah, and a lot of the early campaigns, I was listening to the vivisection panel before, and a lot of these early queries and concerns and campaigns, they have roots all the way back into the mid-1800s. So there's something to be learned here, I think, if we remember our activist mothers. Some of the other campaigns they did besides vivisection was also very much so involved in the fashion industry at the time. Like, one of the major assaults on animals was killing millions, if not billions of birds, driving them to extinction to fuel the fashion trade. And that was a very interesting kind of point of contestation because it was women who were wearing these items, but obviously it was men who were owning the businesses and driving the fashion. But it was also women who were involved in combating that and were responsible for some of the very first animal rights legislation in the UK, in the US, and elsewhere. They were also, believe it or not, involved in a lot of humane slaughter. So the Lizzie Lind F. Hegeby, there I got it out this time, she was very much so interested in that. I think she was also a vegan, which is pretty. She was lesbian, vegan, and one of the first women to get a medical degree. She was amazing. But she was also, she was a bit of a practicalist. She wanted to know, how can we help animals? You know, if we're not going to get people to go vegan, how can we help them? So she actually went and witnessed on her own in many different ways, different slaughtering methods, because when she was active in the turn of the 20th century, the way you killed animals was just poleaxe to the face. That was normal. And the industry fought hard against her activism. She went touring across the country speaking about this, trying to convince people that it's not going to make you sick if you eat animals who've been killed with a stun gun. Instead, people were just kind of had these superstitions about needing to kill animals with a poleaxe in the face instead. So the things that you can imagine, this is kind of the behind the scenes as a researcher. I was brought to tears just reading the sort of stuff that she had observed in her campaigning. So although the humane slaughter thing has long roots, also vegetarianism and veganism are there. Like I said, Anna Kingsford was involved with that. Another alternative they pushed was a nature cure. We don't need all this vivisection, as we just heard from the previous panel. We just need people to have good exercise, clean living spaces, and good nutrition. As you can imagine, also, horses were widely used before automated transportation, and then, of course, massively used in the war. In England alone, 8 million horses and donkeys were killed in the war. So this is another major thing that they were paying attention to. And obviously, dogs and cats, but I'll move on. So some of the challenges, I've already mentioned these, so I won't dwell too long on them. But, we hear about this even today, that, you're just a Bambi hugger, and you're a bunny lover, and a tree hugger, and all that kind of stuff. This goes all the way back to the 1860s, 70s, 80s, y'all. So this term they like to use was sentimentalism, as though this was a terrible thing to have emotions in your head and your body. And also restrictive gender norms and just basically patriarchal institutions. Like I said, it was a fight just for women even to get access to some of these spaces. In fact, Anna Kingsford was kind of suspicious that one of the reasons they used vivisection in medical schools was to actively keep women out, because they knew no woman is going to want to mess with that, right? So sentimentalism was largely charged against women to dismiss their ideas. And a lot of women wrote back, like Frances Power Cobb. I saw her name mentioned a little bit ago. She's an Anglo-Irish woman, also lesbian. And she was saying, well, what's the alternative if being sentimental is such a terrible thing? Like, I'm proudly sentimental, and rightfully so. But they were also, a lot of these women were coming from upper class positions, and they were a little bit also, let's be honest, suspicious of science and rationality, because it challenged existing class relations. It challenged the church and things like that. So that's something that you definitely would have to contend with. That is a legacy in some ways that still sticks with the vegan movement today, that we're anti-science, which is not, well, there are some people who are anti-science. But part of that was simply because, we don't trust scientists with animals, so we don't trust science at all. And we did see that, though, with a lot of these upper-class folks who were coming from a different background in the Victorian era. So capitalism, of course, and the economic logic of growth was the major thing that they're dealing with here. Vivisection and other aspects of animal cruelty, so meat production, live export, et cetera, all this was amping up in an unprecedented level simply because of the Industrial Revolution and this idea that growth is always number one. And so if you're coming in as an activist and you're saying, well, we don't want vivisection, or we don't want to do any of these practices, you're seen as anti-growth, and maybe even against your country, anti-patriotic. Suffrage is another issue here. Women didn't have a vote. It was very hard for them to change laws. So for the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds in England, for instance, they had a lot of difficulty making laws because women couldn't vote. So all they could really do is put pressure on politicians. And incidentally, there was a lot of interplay between the suffrage movement and the anti-vivisectionists and the anti-bird hunters and all that kind of stuff, because they started to become associated with one another. Because a lot of the suffragettes were very much so, saw themselves in what was happening to other animals. So this is where we get the roots of the animal rights movement becoming feminized. There was also issues with race and class, and this is something I hope this summer to make some more time to do, is to delve more in and see, what are working class women doing, and what are women of color doing, because that history has really been erased. I would not dare to assume that there are not women who were not white and not rich and doing work. I'm sure that there were. It's unfortunate, though, that memory is probably lost. So I'm going to see if I can find some more stuff. But also things that inhibited them. You have to remember, this is the dawn of science, the dawn of nutrition. And so it was really scary to say, okay, well, we won't eat meat or milk or eggs, really? So one of the things that the Vegan Society did when it first formed, and by the way, the Vegan Society had already been working with the Vegetarian Society 40 years plus before they formed in 1944. So one of the first orders of business was, how can we figure out vegan nutrition? How can let's spotlight vegan kids, and show parents how to vegan parent, etc. So, like I said, that's not to say that there wasn't any activism happening in the middle of the century, but really things start to pick up, of course, in the 1970s and the 80s, when we see all the other civil rights, social justice activism reinvigorating the movement. So the feminist movement, so just focusing on vegan feminism for the purposes of this presentation, one of the things we see of an interesting overlap is in the feminist kitchens. So this was a whole thing in the suffragette era as well, to have vegetarian cafeterias where women can be freed from the drudgery of all the hard work it takes to kill, and not kill, like to butcher and cook and prepare all these dead animals. Actually, we can go somewhere and have somebody else cook, nice, simple, plant-based fare, and we can talk politics. Well, that was picked up again in the late 20th century. So there are a lot of feminist kitchens that popped up in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and elsewhere. And a lot of them were explicitly vegetarian and vegan-oriented. And the vegan feminist movement at this time is now not just dabbling in vegetarianism, as we saw with the previous wave. Now vegetarianism is assumed. In fact, it's really veganism, but again, they're afraid to call it veganism. If you look at some of the feminists for animal rights discourse, they're basically vegan, they just don't want to be too exclusive of folks. And spirituality and emotion are back with a full force. Now we have ecofeminism and the women's rights movement pushing back and saying, actually, it's okay to be spiritual, it's okay to have emotions as part of our activism and our politics. And so, like originally, this is something that I always thought was what ecofeminism was about, but I never really thought about that underneath vegan feminism, and I definitely didn't see it in the first wave. Now I can safely say that this is a pretty long tradition in women's advocacy. They're definitely being informed by radical feminism in lots of ways, which we're going to come back to in a minute, including anti-pornography, the really heavy support for lesbianism. Like, this is pretty radical stuff in the 20th century, and support for gay rights. There was definitely also a much clearer split from the mainstream animal rights movement. With the first wave, it was just women working with men, and a lot of times women were forced to work separately from men because of institutional sexism. For instance, they'd have to set up auxiliary groups, but really it was an attempt to kind of work all together, and feminism was kind of under the scenes, or as an undercurrent. But it wasn't until really the 1980s with the formation of Feminists for Animal Rights that you see, like, actually, we are pretty distinct from the animal rights movement. We have a different approach. So some of the campaigns are pretty much the same, but also, of course, it's a modern world, and there are some new things to be aware of. The vivisection still remains a very important part of animal rights activism in general in the 20th century, but definitely for the feminists. Now, like I said, we're requiring vegetarianism, pushing for veganism, but they use the term, the Feminists for Animal Rights group would use the term contextual veganism. So basically recognizing that not everybody can be 100% vegan or even vegan at all, and recognizing food deserts and structural inequalities, et cetera, that would complicate things. So we use that today, don't we? So it has a very long history, actually, in the movement. Feminists for Animal Rights and many other organizations, by the way, there are too many for me to list here, were actually very involved in the gay culture, creating lesbian-only groups and political groups and social groups, and working with gay rights organizations, and also, checking them when they're doing stuff like the gay rodeo and saying that's actually counterintuitive, so they would campaign against that kind of stuff. But then, of course, they would also work on the feminist movement, which today still, such a stinker, the feminist movement even today remains pretty closed off to veganism, vegetarianism, and animal rights. But Marty Keel et al. Were very, very much at hard work in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, trying to reach out to feminist organizations, publishing in their magazines, going to their conferences, trying to get animals heard. There was also attempts to work with the Greens, so you can imagine at this time, the late 20th century, the Green parties were now a new strategy from the environmental movement, trying to make change from the inside out. Well, of course, the eco-feminists and the vegan feminists were reaching out and saying, well, what about animals? Got to be consistent. And some of the nastiest, ugliest, y'all, I had to step back from my computer screen for a while, because Marty Keel saved everything, y'all. It's their own record. Some of the nasty, ugly stuff that the people from the Green parties, and this is in the United States, although she did work with other outside of the United States, but some of the ugly stuff about these vegans, these vegetarians, these animal rights people, and just saying really nasty, horrible things that basically left them rather disillusioned with any bridge making with the Greens. And I think that kind of... I teach environmental politics at the University of Kent, and here we are decades later, and I would say we're still kind of at the same issue where the Greens don't really take animals seriously. But they tried. Another thing that they did, which is really, really interesting, is they started doing domestic violence intervention, recognizing the intersection between violence against animals, men's violence against animals, and men's violence against women, and recognizing that for a lot of women, they can't really escape because they don't want to leave their animals behind. And so they created some interesting and really novel ways that inform law enforcement today, by the way, and social work today, and how to care for women and children in distress and also make sure that their animals are accommodated. So they had some like underground sanctuary systems put in place. And then, of course, they're also dealing with sexism and animal rights, speaking directly to the animal rights movement, which this is where I like to place myself. I like to take up this baton. I always like to talk back to the movement and when they're doing sexist, silly stuff. But yeah, lots of amazing stuff. But it created a bit of a wedge, didn't it? Because when we saw with PETA, for instance, start their nonsense in the 90s, really the feminists, we couldn't go back at that point. Incidentally, PETA used to work with feminist groups all the time, obviously run by a woman. But something happened in the 1990s where they changed their ways. They used to even fund feminists for animal rights, so that's a sad lost legacy. Oh, and also a lot of anti-war stuff that they did. Yeah, so obviously with the animal rights thing, that was a major, like, where do we stand? Are we feminists or are we animal rights people? And are we something different? So it was not only just was it, do we create feminist-only spaces? At one point, they were like, do we create just women-only spaces? So no men allowed. Well, how do you police that? So they kind of dealt with that in some of the newsletters. Are we feminists or eco-feminists? There's a lot of debate on that. If you don't put eco-feminists in there, you're forgetting nature. There's lots of debate in the late 80s and 90s on that. Well, should we use patriarchal language? Are we really about rights and liberation? Or rights, rather, or are we just about liberation and kind of critical caring? So there's a lot of debate actually on whether or not to use patriarchal animal rights language and procedures. As I said, veganism was kind of contextualized and became a point of discussion as well. And then, yeah, there was a lot of shaky alliance making. But this was kind of the heart of vegan feminism in the late 20th century. Let's build bridges. And this is a legacy that we're still fumbling around with today. I would say we've made progress in a lot of ways, but in other ways we still remain quite siloed. So this brings us up to the present, 20th to 21st century to present. You might ask, oh, why there? Well, there's a few reasons why I would say 2000 onward. First off, in 1980, and this I've covered in my second book, Piecemeal Protests, where I look at the impact of capitalism and the nonprofit system on social movements. And by 1980, we see that the animal rights movement is moving towards professionalization. Incidentally, so was Feminists for Animal Rights, and that was one of the reasons why it went defunct, because not a lot of organizations survived that rocky transition to professionalization and are probably better suited to being grassroots. But grassroots is out of style now, right? Well, by 2000, the animal rights movement is basically professionalized. The grassroots style is pretty much gone. So that's a whole different sort of ballgame we're dealing with. I would say this nonprofit professionalized space is very masculinized. And it is very much so a deterrent to feminized grassroots activism. But also we, of course, have technological and digital change, which meant that more people like me, can have a voice. You read it or don't read it, but it's out there. And that was a big change. When I first became an activist at 17, around 2000 or so, if I had a voice, nobody cared. Well, then I had the internet. Got my first computer. And I got on there and started... That would have been really difficult to do in the 1980s or 90s, wouldn't it? So this is a really radical shift for feminists. So not only we're dealing with, on one hand, professionalization that is kind of dampening the feminist approach and sort of masculinizing the social movement space further, but on the other hand, now we have democratic access to space. They can't stop the internet. They can't shut me up there. They can block my comments and ignore my emails, but I'll just put it on a blog or go to this conference. We also see more international collaboration because of the internet. So, and then things like this, like I've many colleagues in this room who do not live in the same country as me. So what a wonderful thing the internet can be sometimes. And the other cool thing that we start seeing in this new wave is a renewed attention to intersectionality. I've made the case that intersectionality has been a part of the movement all along, maybe not always so good with race and class, but certainly interested in gender issues and, well, yeah, to be fair, sometimes with class issues as well, but not so great on race. We'll come back to that. But certainly by the 20th century, we're seeing that this is a real thing that we want to prioritize, right? If you don't pay attention to this, someone will catch you on it. And that's what we need. We need to have some kind of gentle encouragement to start paying attention to, who are we speaking about, who are we speaking for? As I said, there are a number of challenges, however, in the third wave, professionalization being one of those. One of the things I didn't mention with professionalization, not only is it a masculine way of organizing, it's very hierarchical, very much so based on who you know and how much money you made and what kind of degree you have. But it also de-radicalizes. So we see, and I've got evidence for this in my second book where I just track a bunch of organizations, and the second they professionalize, they start to compromise. And so veganism kind of gets put on the chopping block, if you will. So that is a big problem. One of the other challenges that we have now is challenging gender essentialism. And this is something that is covered in Kadri's book that I cited at the beginning. Like, how do we deal with the fact that gender is a social construct? It's not just men and women or masculinity and femininity. We have non-binary people, we have intersex people, we have transgender people, and the gender boxes aren't really working so much for us anymore. So how do we deal with that? How do we make our theory relevant in a much more gender fluid society? The anti-pornography approach of the second wave movement, and also, by the way, it was present in the first wave as well, that becomes a little bit more challenging now in a more sex-positive cultural setting, I suppose, where it's an interesting thing. Like, pornography is way more expansive than it ever was in the 80s or 90s. It's like a part of life now. And some would say, I would say it's a lot more violent in a lot of ways, and it's ubiquitous. And yet we also have a sex-positive approach from feminism challenging these criticisms and making it difficult to make analyses without offending or leaving out some groups, such as like transgender people who are marginalized from regular work and sometimes have to use sex work to survive. Like, how do we accommodate all these different approaches to sex? And then, yes, of course, there's limitations to intersectionality. This is something that I haven't really, could have done a whole slide on this, but I'm still working through it because this is coming through in my interviews. A lot of people, like Laura Ornelius, who was in the previous slide, I interviewed her, and she's like, can I be honest? She basically was like, can I be honest? I don't believe in this intersectionality stuff. She thinks it's problematic. Of course, she's the most intersectional person I've ever met in the movement ever, but it's just the way that she says it gets framed and used and sometimes like corrupted. Dinesh Wadewell, I've recently read a book by him called Animal Capital. It's a dense read, but he also challenges that. And it's like, you know what? We're looking at working class movements. They don't really give a shit about animals. And can you blame them? So is intersectionality really going to work in some situations, and how can we work around that? So that is a big part of this project I need to sit with and try to figure out how to map, I suppose. Another thing that came through in my research is Eurocentrism, like big time. One of my reviewers, like I said earlier, said we need to challenge that. And so I've been actively researching into non-American, non-European spaces to see what I can find. I've got a whole chapter bursting at the seams, but not so many people who are from non-European spaces, actually. I don't think I have any. I have some people from Poland, I have someone from Spain, Canada, New Zealand, I have French Canada, etc. But no, I don't have anybody who is, from outside of Europe or the West, basically. So we need to start spotlighting those voices, I think, and making space for them. And then, of course, the big challenge I didn't even think about because it was so right in front of my face was Donald Trump. So right as this book was coming to the point where I'm ready to start interviews, I started interviews in January. And if you don't know about American politics, January, is when the presidents switch over. So Sleepy Joe, gotta go. In comes this, fascist. So I didn't take into consideration, because I'm so very privileged that I got out right when Donald Trump was elected the first time in England now. I didn't think about, though, the impact that he would be having on my potential subjects, participants. And more than one person, I can't participate because I'm disabled, and I don't know if I'm going to be allowed to live under Donald Trump's regime, and I don't know how I'm going to feed myself. I had another person who's transgender who participated, and they chose not to be recorded because right now in the United States, if you do anything that's about social justice and they catch you on social media or any public space, you could be, who knows, kidnapped. That's happening right now. because it's America is becoming fascist. Well, it's always been a little bit fascist, but you know what I mean? Out in the open fascist. So yeah, Trumpism, like I need to actually backtrack and accommodate the impact of him. So now I'm coming towards the end of it, and I just want to give you some like concluding overall thoughts on what is vegan feminism, where are we going? As I said, I had a few limitations, too many Americans, sorry, just kind of, it's like a who you know sort of thing, it's kind of a bias. And then also had limited access to archives. That's one of the reasons I'm so pleased to be here today. The university system in the United Kingdom is under full collapse, and we have not had any research funding in years. So I have no money to go to conferences or to go to archives or anything. So I had to just use what was freely available online. Like I said, I had some people who said, I just can't participate because I'm worn out by Trump, or I'm dealing with depression and anxiety, which a lot of animal activists deal with, right? And quite a lot of people, I'm going to write a whole paper on this, quite a lot of women felt like they were imposters, that they weren't good enough to participate in my study. Like, well, who am I, first off? Like, just some Joe Schmo in the movement. But so many women just felt like they weren't important enough to have their voices heard. People who I cite, people who I look up to, people who like hold special places in my heart as a young activist now as an adult. And so I think this is one of the reasons I want to do this project, is to remember that what we're doing, this work here, may seem insignificant in the larger scheme of the animal rights movement, but it's so important. And we always have to be thinking about, it might not seem that relevant to us, but think about the people who are paying attention, reading, and looking up to us, people who are coming up in the movement. So what is vegan feminism? Well, it depends on who you ask. There's lots of different approaches. I would say that it's very consciously emotional, the sentimentalism that the Victorian ladies were dealing with. Like, look, unabashedly sentimental I shall be. It's a radical caring. It's a nurturing in a non-essentialist way, right? It's the fact that we're human beings, and human beings are caring social species. So let's embrace that. Let's rehumanize ourselves, I suppose, in a way, and acknowledge that amazing thing about our own species. It challenges hierarchies. This is one thing you can say for sure. It's definitely intersectionally minded in lots of different ways with its challenges, and very much so engaged in other causes, anti-war, LGBT, feminism, of course, environmentalism, trans, et cetera, et cetera. It's very queer and allied. This is one of the things that I didn't know that until I started really doing this research, is how gay the movement was. It's super gay. It's great, isn't it? Like, we don't talk about how gay it is. It's gay as hell. But especially the feminist side of things, right? And there's a reason for that. Like, now it's okay to talk about this and laugh, but I was doing research for the Vegan Society through their journal. And in the 1990s, in the classified ads, there would be gay vegans like looking to meet up with other gay vegans or create social events or whatever. And then there started to be, and Vegan Society published these letters, people complaining about the gays. We don't want our movement associated with the gays. Well, little did I know until I started this book, was at the same time the movement was very, very gay. Like Marty Keel used to hold completely vegan, completely lesbian social events at her home for years. And lots of women who were involved with the Feminists for Animal Rights organization were gay, and openly so. Like, this is pretty cool. But even moving back into the Victorian times, like, they didn't have the language for it, or they couldn't say it or whatever, but they were openly living with other women, and they were gay, and everybody knew they were gay. All right. So yeah, and it's also a multicultural affair. Well, we're trying to be, we aspire to be, don't we? And especially with multiracial perspectives as well. But this is to a point, as I've seen in my research. I've seen a lot of pushback and more voices from people of color and other cultures in the third wave, but not so much in the first and the second wave. And I'm not saying that they didn't have any voice, well, they didn't. They were just taken from them. But I'm not saying that they didn't have any contributions. I'm willing to bet there's tons there. It just needs to be found and remembered. So we are an aspirational movement. We are an imperfect movement. We are vegan feminists. Visions! So this is my last slide. Here, after all this work I've done with this, and I feel like it's at the end of the journey, but really the hard work is taking this 100,000 words and revising them and incorporating all these interviews. That's the last half of this year. But I have enough in my brain now to really sit back and reflect a bit about, well, what are we going to do looking forward, right? This is a Compassionate Futures conference. One of the most important things, and I think, Laura, you've also done research in this, is managing compassion, fatigue, and burnout. One of the things I've noticed also, this is a sort of coming of age story also, like me as a vegan feminist in the world, Because one of the things I've noticed as I've gotten older is my tolerance. Someone was saying earlier, like, this book doesn't have any of that stuff that'll keep you up at night. I don't have tolerance for that anymore. I felt when I was younger, the angry little vegan, I need to learn. And to an extent, I still feel that because I'm an educator. But I can't because it keeps me up at night. And I feel like it's becoming such an emotional burden on me that sometimes I'm like, how can I go on? Like, just to be frank, like, I feel very in the depths of it. Do I have another 40 years of suffering? And like, Karen Davis, sorry, this is a slight side story, RIP Karen Davis, she did a lot of this work as well, specifically looking at chickens. But she was first brought into the movement because she was a Jewish woman, and she was horrified in the 1960s as an activist about what she learned about the Holocaust. She was so brought down by that. She went to see psychologists, and the psychologist said, Karen, it sounds like you have a Holocaust gas chambers in your mind. And I think she shared that story because that's what we're all dealing with, aren't we, with this heavy information, especially from a feminist perspective, where we are in tune with that empathy. But I feel that we need to find a way to manage compassion fatigue. I have a slaughterhouse of my mind. I have a feedlot of my mind. I have a zoo of my mind. I have a laboratory, vivisection laboratory of my mind every waking minute, and especially at night. How do we deal with that? So that's what I'm doing looking forward, is how do we build up more positive, supportive spaces so that we can continue and be healthy and reasonably happy in a world that is really so corrupt and violent. We also need to be looking back at intersectionality, taking some of these criticisms to heart and thinking about how we'll move forward in a coherent and compassionate and ethical way. We need to bring more global voices in. We need more cross-cultural encounters. I know Spain is considered the West for everybody, but for me, like a little girl from the South, like, it's a big deal to be in Spain. To go to a restaurant, like yesterday I tried to go order and they didn't know English. Sorry. But I think it's important for us to have these exchanges so that we can push our boundaries, right? We need to make more space for creativity and community. Conferences like this are vital. They're our lifeblood, right? It's so important that we keep sustaining these. We need to explore more gender fluidity. How do we figure out how to critique gender, critique sexism without reinforcing these categories that have been enforced on us? Gender knows no boundaries, right? But we got to have some kind of boundaries to make sense of it. So how do we deal with that? And then, of course, we need to continue that conversation that the Feminists for Animal Rights group, specifically Marty Keel, had started, and start encouraging some conversations with mainstream feminism. They keep pushing us back. We need to keep knocking on the door because it's so obvious. Animals matter in so many ways. We'll get them to pay attention. So that's it. Thank you for listening and giving some attention to this journey, this story that I'm working on, and I appreciate any feedback you have or contributions, and yeah, thank you for listening. Muchas gracias.
Okay, thank you very much, Corey. Wow. I mean, that was a lot, and thank you very much for reconstructing this vegan feminist history, her stories. I don't know what would be the best term, but of course, I mean, it's so inspiring, and I have already a lot of questions, but I will let also the public comment and make questions if you have. We have some minutes. So does anybody want to ask something?
Thank you very much for the great presentation. Can you hear me? I think it's weird. Yeah, it's okay?
Sorry, I turned it off.
I think I turned it off.
No, I think it's working.
Yeah, that's working.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you very much. And I really appreciate that you talk about the future, because that was one of the questions that I wanted to ask or present in the first panel of today. Is I think that we need more imagination. I think we are not very good or creating new scenarios. I don't think that we are very good until now. I don't think that we will be very focused on what we don't like and criticizing what is already done and we need to understand that. But I think that we really need to educate ourselves in imagination, moral imagination, how we really want the future. Because otherwise, I don't think that we are creating new paths or new futures. And I don't think that again, I include myself, of course, because it's a different scenario, a different exercise for the brain to sit down and imagine like how future will be. I mean, collectively, how we imagine the future by putting the words, putting the images. I mean, really, in the operational, because I think it's very, very important. Otherwise, we will continue just resisting what is done or what it is, but we are not creating. And I think the energy also should be on the future, but really like imagining, right? Like how will be the cities, for example, talking about the urban, right? Like how really is the best way collectively design that, right? Like everything, but just to sit down and just have and we can change that. But I think we need to start doing that more like very, very strongly. So thank you. So how you imagine? I will ask. So how it comes to your mind? I mean, not everything, but just scenarios. In business, we call it scenarios, because that's how we focus and then help us to go do the operational part. So thank you, Corey.
There's a new book on, I think it's called Hetero-Utopias or something. Zoe Sutton just sent it to me, and I've not had a chance to read it yet, but there are people doing that work. I think that there are lessons to be learned from other movements. The gay pride movement, the gay pride campaign rather, like that's not the movement, that was one of their campaigns. Like, okay, we can kind of critique, but what kind of future do we envision? We envision a world where it's okay to be gay, and gays being great. Let's do it. And so Pride is like a moment where you can step into that future. Well, I mean, it's super camp and loud and lots of music, but this is the future. We can create it. Like there are opportunities that the vegan movement creates, but probably not on such a scale. There's a vegan camp out in the UK, which I won't touch with a 10-foot clown pole because they never have women as speakers. You heard it here. And they resist me when I can critique that. Carol Adams also was very much, if you get in a conversation with her, she'll take you all kinds of places. But one of the places she took me was her love of poetry and art. And I think that the creatives are very important for imagining a future as well. So there's quite a few really good vegan poetry books. I'm not, shame on me, my partner is a poet and I don't do poetry, but I like art and I like film and I like music. And I think creativity is a place where we can, I think it's an approachable thing. You don't have to be an academic and write these books and things. You can write a song, you can perform a poem, you can start imagining in that way. And the other thing I will note, one of the coolest things I've seen about Barcelona is right next to my hotel, there's 2 vegan stores. What? And so I walked in and they chat with you and it's like, oh, everything is vegan. And it's just, in that moment when you walk in, it's like, you're in a place where and even then, don't check the ingredients. You don't have to. It's great. And of course, it's a community space as well, right? So I think creating community spaces, fun stuff with no scary images and stuff that keeps you up at night. Our version of Pride. And more vegan stuff in Pride, actually. Yeah.
Okay, I think we can have one last question. I'm sorry, but you can later.
Sorry, I went too long.
Talk with Corey.
We want to eat.
Hi, Dr. Wrenn. Thank you for your very inspiring presentation. I was wondering, because you brought up Karen Davis and the Holocaust, and there was also a Breeze Harper. I'm wondering if in the vegan feminisms, where the discussion stands in terms of all the problematics surrounding the analogies of non-human animals, slavery with the history of human slavery, and the Holocaust and all that. Patterson, well, the entire debate, so I'll keep it.
It's a pretty clear division, and I think it's across waves. So Karen Davis is very much so an advocate, and she has a family history as a Jewish woman. She's a war baby. So she's well within her right. She's used that very liberally, the Holocaust discussion, in lots of her books. But she's also of a different generation. And again, she's not with us anymore. But when I see people of the third wave talking about it, we don't see very much support for that anymore. And so I think it's just a different time, different culture. I mean, if it's your culture and you want to write about it that way, go for it. You're writing to your own people. But I think for the most part, we realize it's, and when I say we, I'm like lots of different third wavers like myself have made this point. It just tends to be triggering. Even kind of, I used to be very much so about calling it what it is with rape. Like, rape is rape. Like, this is what's happening to animals is rape. And I used to be very unapologetic about that. And then I started to think about it a little bit more, and actually, like 1 in 3 women have either been sexually assaulted or raped or almost raped. And so it's an everyday experience for most women. So what do we do when we're like, it's rape, it's rape? We trying to like shame or trigger or re-traumatize people into believing us? I don't think it's the most compassionate way of going about it. That doesn't mean it's not accurate. It's just about being a little bit more careful about how we make our comparisons. And the other thing also is that we diminish sometimes the experiences of non-human animals and using our own frameworks to make sense of it. So that's, I mean, I sometimes I will use those analogies, but not often. In the past, I published a paper comparing it to slavery, and I would not stand by that paper today. I wrote that when I was in graduate school. I don't know. It's not my story to start using for non-human animals. And actually, I think non-human animals deserve their own critiques, I suppose. So I think it's a generational divide, somewhat, in feminism anyway. 2 minutes.
2 more minutes.
I was very excited to see also the connection between spirituality, because I'm very on spirituality and veganism. Very interesting on that. I was wondering, because every time that I speak about spirituality, not religion, but spirituality, I find this very challenging in the movement. And I like that, because that means that there is something that we need to explore. So when you talk about that, I just said, okay, maybe that's why it's the masculine, I don't know.
Yeah.
Imagine, it just came to my mind. So maybe the tension that we find in the movement is possible because the patriarchy, they don't consider this tension like good or I don't know how justified, or that connection shouldn't be there, something like that. You think that it's a hint? Because if it was in the past, it was in, you know what I'm talking about? Like spirituality, gender, and veganism. Maybe it's like a triangle there. Yeah. I mean, what's your thought about that?
Well, I stand on, I have a foot in two worlds with this, because I was raised, believe it or not, I was in the South, in Appalachia. I was raised an atheist, and I still am an atheist. I identify as an atheist, and also I'm a scientist. I got multiple degrees in science. But nowadays, I also openly identify as a witch. Ooh. And that's my form of science-friendly, atheist-friendly spiritual connection to animals and the earth, because I have to leave tomorrow because I'm jetting back off to Avebury for summer solstice, and I cannot miss summer solstice. It's like I must be there. So just to give you my background on that. So generally what has happened is since the 19th century, because of that spirituality and that hokum, because a lot of them, they held seances and stuff. They were like straight up witches. There was an active attempt by the patriarchal animal rights movement to silence that, step down on it, especially Peter Singer. We could do a whole conference on Peter Singer and the ills of Peter Singer. One of the things he did was we need rational conversation. So it's kind of poo-pooed that spiritualistic approach. But I'm just giving space for that. Even as someone like myself who's a scientist and an atheist, I've come around in my older years. So I need some kind of spiritual connection to the earth to get me through this shit. So, shall we eat?
Yes, thank you. Let's go to have lunch together. Give a big applause.